My name is Elias, and last night I watched my fiancée marry my boss on a yacht I paid for with the code they stole from me. They told the world I was a traitor who tried to hack the company, but they forgot one thing. I didn't just build the walls of their empire, I built the secret door. As they toasted to their self-made success, I hit a single key. Across the city, their credit cards declined, their smart locks jammed, and their names vanished from the national database. They wanted a life without me? Fine. I'll give them a life where they don't even exist. I spent 5 years living in the flickering blue light of a terminal, breathing life into a ghost. I called it Aegis, a revolutionary data encryption protocol designed to be an impenetrable shield. While most software has a lock, mine had a conscience. It could detect an intrusion before the hacker even knew they'd been spotted. It was my masterpiece, born from 18-hour days, cold coffee, and the absolute belief that I was building a future for Julian and Sarah. Julian was the face, the charismatic, silver-tongued CEO of Apex Cyber who could sell a glass of water to a drowning man. I was the spine. Every time Julian stood on a stage at a tech conference, basking in the applause of investors, he was standing on the back of my labor. He would talk about his vision and his breakthrough, while I sat in the darkened back row, invisible and content. I didn't care about the spotlight. I cared about the code, and I cared about the woman sitting next to me. Sarah was the company's lead strategist, but to me, she was the reason I kept going. She would bring me dinner when I forgot to eat, her hand lingering on my shoulder as I explained the elegant complexity of a new algorithm. "You're a genius, Elias," she'd whisper, her eyes reflecting the scrolling green text on my screen. "One day, this is going to make us a legacy. We'll have the life we always dreamed of." I believed every word. I gave her my passwords, my encryption keys, and my heart, thinking we were building a fortress together. I didn't realize that while I was building a shield to protect the world, they were building a cage for me. I was the architect of the most sophisticated security software on the planet, but I was blinded by a vulnerability no code could patch. Loyalty. Julian would slap me on the back and call me the secret weapon, but behind the boardroom doors, he was already filing patents in his own name. Sarah wasn't just checking in on my progress. She was mapping my habits, learning my overrides, and preparing the kill switch for my career. They treated me like a high-functioning tool, something to be polished while useful and discarded when the job was done. I gave them the keys to the kingdom, thinking I was the prince, never realizing I was just the mason who would be buried within the walls. They thought I was too immersed in my logic to notice the shifting shadows, but they forgot the most fundamental rule of my craft. An architect always knows the weak points of his own structure. They were about to learn that the shield I built for them was the only thing standing between them and the monster they had created. The betrayal didn't come with a shout. It arrived with a soft, practiced click of a mouse. It was a Monday morning, the air in the office humming with the electric tension of the upcoming acquisition. I was finalizing the last layer of the Aegis core when Sarah walked into my glass-walled cubicle. She wasn't carrying coffee this time. She was carrying a manila folder and an expression of manufactured grief that should have won her an Oscar. "Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to trigger my protective instincts. "Julian found something. A massive data leak. Customer records, encryption keys, they've all been routed to a private server in Eastern Europe. The digital signature on the transfer is yours." I laughed, a short, bewildered sound. "Sarah, that's impossible. My signature is encrypted with a 24-character salt. No one has that except..." The words died in my throat as I looked at her. The hand that had lingered on my shoulder for years was now cold, resting on the desk as two burly security guards materialized in the doorway behind her. I looked down at my monitors and saw the screen flashing red. My administrative access was being stripped in real time. Files were being deleted, logs were being rewritten, and my own code was being weaponized to brand me a criminal. Julian stepped into view, his tailored suit sharp enough to draw blood. He didn't look angry, he looked disappointed, a father figure forced to discipline a wayward son. "I really wanted to believe in you, Elias," he said, loud enough for the entire open-plan office to hear. "But the evidence is undeniable. You were selling our proprietary secrets to the highest bidder before the acquisition could even close." I looked at Sarah, searching for a flicker of the woman I loved, but all I saw was the lead strategist of Apex Cyber calculating the value of my exit. She had used the keys I gave her. She had waited until I was at my most vulnerable, exhausted and focused on the finish line, to plant the black bag on my digital doorstep. "Hand over the badge," Julian commanded. One of the guards stepped forward, his hand heavy on my shoulder, the same shoulder Sarah used to touch. I reached for my neck and unclipped the plastic lanyard. The badge that had been my pride, my proof of belonging, felt like a lead weight. As I handed it to Julian, he didn't just take it, he dropped it into a wastebasket. "You're blacklisted, Elias," Sarah said, her voice finally dropping the facade of sorrow for a cold metallic pragmatism. "No tech firm will touch you. You're lucky we aren't calling the FBI today. Get out before we change our minds." I was escorted through the lobby, past the rows of colleagues who were already averting their eyes, and pushed out into the glaring sunlight of the sidewalk. The glass doors hissed shut, locking with a sound that signaled the end of my life as I knew it. They had stolen my soul, branded me a traitor, and taken my future. But as I stood there, empty-handed and humiliated, a cold, dark logic began to overwrite my despair. They had my badge, they had my office, and they had my bride, but they didn't have the ghost I had hidden in the machine. They thought they had deleted me, but I was just moving to the background. The Neon Palms motel smelled of stale cigarettes and industrial-grade bleach, a far cry from the glass and steel cathedral of Apex Cyber. I sat on the edge of a bed with springs that groaned under the weight of my failure, the flickering light of a second-hand laptop illuminating the grime on the walls. My world had shrunk to 10 square feet of stained carpet, but my reach was starting to stretch back into the world that had cast me out. I turned on the television, a relic with a cracked screen, just in time to see Julian and Sarah beaming at a camera crew. They were standing on the balcony of a penthouse I knew they hadn't owned a month ago. The news ticker at the bottom of the screen screamed in bold yellow, "Apex acquisition finalized. Julian Vance and Sarah Miller become tech's newest power couple." Julian was wearing a watch that cost more than my college tuition, gesturing broadly as he described the revolutionary security he had single-handedly developed. "We had to purge some dead weight to get here," he told the interviewer with a wink that made my skin crawl. "In this industry, you're either the shield or the crack in the wall. We chose to be the shield." Sarah stood beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, looking like a queen who had finally secured her throne. She spoke about integrity and vision, her eyes sparkling with the cold brilliance of a diamond. To the world, they were innovators, heroes of the digital age. To me, they were scavengers feasting on a carcass they hadn't even killed themselves. I watched as the reporter asked about their upcoming wedding, the social event of the year, on a private yacht in the Mediterranean. Sarah laughed, that melodic sound that used to be my favorite song, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's about celebrating the life we've built," she said. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but not from fear. It was a rhythmic, calculated vibration. I tapped a key on my laptop, opening a window of scrolling black and white text. While they were picking out floral arrangements and offshore accounts, I was scavenging the motel's unstable Wi-Fi to build a digital bunker. I was a ghost now, no bank account, no professional standing, no identity. Julian and Sarah had deleted Elias the architect, but they had inadvertently cleared the cache for Elias the executioner. Every night I watched them climb higher, their faces plastered over every tech blog and magazine cover, their success fueled by the blood of my career. They thought the distance between the Neon Palms and their penthouse was a canyon they had successfully crossed. They didn't realize that in the world of data, distance is an illusion. I wasn't just watching them, I was cataloging them. I was learning the rhythm of their new lives, waiting for the moment they felt most untouchable. You can't kill a ghost, but a ghost can certainly haunt you until there's nothing left to scream for. I didn't need a key to get back into Apex. Julian and Sarah had left the front door wide open, draped in the velvet curtains of their own vanity. As I sat in the dim, flickering light of the motel room, I began a deep tissue scan of the Aegis core. I expected to find my work scrubbed, my logic overwritten by some high-priced consultant they'd hired to sanitize the theft. But as the lines of code began to populate my screen, I felt a surge of dark, predatory joy. Julian had been so eager to claim the breakthrough as his own that he hadn't touched a single line of the foundation. To him, the software was a black box, a magical engine that produced money and fame. He was too arrogant to believe that the dead weight he'd fired could have hidden a trap in plain sight. He had kept the core logic intact because he was terrified that if he changed a single variable, the whole illusion would collapse. He didn't understand the machine. He only understood the prophet. Deep within the kernel of the encryption layer, I found it, my ghost protocol. It was a tiny, elegant piece of recursive logic I'd written in the 3rd year of development. It wasn't a bug, it was a signature, a mathematical proof of my authorship that doubled as a master override. I had designed it to bypass the shield in the event of a total system failure, a failsafe that only I knew existed. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the clicks echoing like a countdown in the cramped motel room. I sent a heartbeat ping to the Apex servers. For a tense second, the cursor blinked in the void. Then, a single line appeared, access granted. Welcome, creator. The irony was delicious. They were currently marketing Aegis as the world's only zero-vulnerability system, charging governments and billionaires millions for a security they didn't actually control. Every smart device in their lives, Julian's biometric locked safe, Sarah's encrypted cloud storage, the security grid of their penthouse, was now an extension of my fingertips. They had moved into a fortress of my making, thinking it would keep the world out, never realizing they had locked themselves in with me. I watched the data streams begin to flow. I could see their private calendars, their offshore transfer history, and even the real-time feed from the cameras in their hallway. To them, I was a memory, a blacklisted ghost fading in a cheap motel. But through that back door, I was more present in their lives than they could possibly imagine. I wasn't just in their system, I was the system. Julian and Sarah had invited a Trojan horse into the very center of their empire, and they were too busy admiring the gold plating to notice the soldier hiding inside. The infiltration was complete. Now, the erasure could begin. I didn't want to destroy them all at once. A quick death is a mercy, and I wasn't feeling merciful. I wanted them to experience the slow, grinding erosion of their sanity, the feeling of a world turning against its masters. Through the Ghost Protocol, I became the unseen hand in their perfect lives, a digital poltergeist haunting the very luxury they had stolen from me. It started with Julian's pride. On the morning he was set to meet with the Department of Defense, his custom electric sedan stayed dead in the driveway. From my motel room, I watched through the car's internal diagnostics as he pressed the ignition over and over, his face turning a frantic shade of crimson. The car wasn't broken, it was simply convinced it was in a permanent state of collision. I let him wait for a tow truck for 3 hours, watching him scream into his phone while his career-making meeting happened without him. Then I turned my attention to Sarah. She had always been obsessed with her image, carefully curating every public pixel to project an aura of untouchable elegance. I bypassed her military-grade cloud storage and found the raw, unedited drafts of her life, the frantic emails to lawyers, the tactical notes on how to manipulate Julian, and a series of vanity photos she'd never intended for public eyes. I didn't leak them to a tabloid, I leaked them to her inner circle group chat, the wives of the investors she was so desperate to impress. I watched through her phone's front camera as she realized her private world was suddenly public property, her poise dissolving into a panicked, shaking mess. But the most satisfying strike was the leaking pennies script. I wrote a recursive loop that triggered every time they used a credit card. It didn't drain their accounts in a flash. Instead, for every dollar they spent, my script redirected 3 cents to a series of untraceable charities for displaced tech workers. It was a tiny nagging anomaly that drove Julian's accountants into a frenzy. They could see the money leaving, but they couldn't see where. To a man like Julian, losing control over his wealth was like losing his skin. They began to live in a state of constant, low-level dread. Every smart bulb in the penthouse flickered in Morse code they couldn't read. Every thermostat spiked to 90 degrees in the middle of the night. They were surrounded by the most expensive technology on the planet, and none of it obeyed them anymore. I sat in the dark of the neon palms, my fingers dancing across the keys, feeling their heartbeat through the grid. They thought they were being haunted by bad luck. They didn't realize that the shield they had stolen was actually a mirror, reflecting every bit of their ugliness back at them, one glitch at a time. The glitches had served their purpose, fraying the nerves of my betrayers until they were jumping at shadows. But a haunted house is merely a nuisance. I wanted to turn their world into a tomb. It was time to stop playing with the lights and start erasing the people behind them. In the digital age, you are only as real as the servers say you are. If you don't exist in the database, you don't exist at all. I bypassed the federal firewall using a 0-day vulnerability I'd been saving for a moment of true necessity. Once inside the National Registry, I didn't just delete Julian and Sarah's files. That would have been too simple, too easily rectified. Instead, I moved them to the Death Master file. With a few keystrokes, I issued digital death certificates for both of them, backdated by 48 hours. To the IRS, the Social Security Administration, and every major credit bureau, Julian Vance and Sarah Miller were no longer living entities. They were ghosts, their assets frozen by the state, their identities liquidated. But I wasn't done. I navigated to the Interpol Red Notice database, the global list for the world's most wanted fugitives. I didn't need to invent crimes for them. I simply took the evidence of the data theft they had used against me and repackaged it. I uploaded the Aegis blueprints to a dark web server I had previously flagged for federal monitoring, then linked that server directly to Julian's private IP address. I replaced their clean records with high-priority alerts for corporate espionage, money laundering, and state-level treason. I watched through the penthouse security feed as the reality of my work began to hit. Julian was trying to pay for a private security detail, but his cards were being declined with a code he'd never seen before, account holder deceased. He tried to call his lawyer, but his phone service had been terminated. He was a dead man screaming into a plastic brick. Sarah sat on the floor, staring at her laptop as she watched her own face pop up on an international watch list. The woman who had built her life on strategy was now watching the world's most powerful police forces coordinate her arrest. They had wanted a life where I didn't exist. Now, they were getting exactly what they asked for, but with a terrifying twist, they were the ones who had vanished. Their names were gone, replaced by alphanumeric strings in a criminal database. Their wealth was inaccessible, locked behind a wall of post-mortem legalities. I sat in my motel room, the blue light of the terminal reflected in my eyes, feeling no pity. I had been a ghost for months, living in the shadows they created. Now, they were joining me in the dark. The paperwork of the dead was signed and filed. Tomorrow, the world would come to collect what was left of them. The morning of the Apex IPO was supposed to be the coronation of Julian Vance. The New York Stock Exchange was draped in Apex banners, and the giant digital displays in Times Square were primed to broadcast the Aegis launch to a global audience. I watched the live feed from my motel room as Julian stepped onto the podium, his smile wide and vacuous, unaware that he was standing on a trapdoor I had already unlatched. He raised the ceremonial gavel, ready to ring the bell that would turn his stolen dreams into billions of dollars. As his hand descended, I hit the execute key. The bell rang, but the ticker didn't show the Apex stock price. Instead, the massive digital billboards behind him flickered and died, replaced by a scrolling black screen of raw system logs. In the middle of Times Square, the world saw the truth, a side-by-side comparison of my original source code and the proprietary Apex software. I had labeled every line they had stolen with a red timestamp, proving it was created years before Julian even knew what encryption meant. The gasps from the floor of the exchange were audible over the broadcast. But I wasn't finished. I triggered a script that dumped Julian and Sarah's private, black file onto every terminal on the trading floor. The screens were suddenly flooded with their deleted emails, the ones where Julian joked about my disposable loyalty and Sarah detailed the exact steps they took to frame me. The refined power couple of Silicon Valley was being dismantled in high definition, their voices reading out their own crimes in front of the very investors they were trying to swindle. Pandemonium erupted. The stock price, which had opened at a record high, plummeted toward zero in a vertical line of red. I watched through a hacked security camera as Julian's face turned from confusion to a mask of sheer, animal terror. Sarah grabbed his arm, her eyes darting toward the exits, but the doors were already being blocked by federal agents. My Interpol Red Notice had finally synchronized with the NYSE security system. The Aegis shield, the very thing Julian had just touted as impenetrable, was now projecting the warrant for his arrest across the entire building. The broadcast was cut, but I didn't need the TV anymore. I could hear the echoes of the downfall through the data streams. In less than 60 seconds, I had turned their billion-dollar empire into a smoking crater. They had used my name to build a lie, so I used their platform to deliver the truth. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, I leaned back in my creaky motel chair. The IPO hadn't just failed, it had become a public execution. Julian and Sarah were no longer the future of tech, they were a cautionary tale, written in the code they thought they owned. They didn't make it to the airport. By the time Julian and Sarah scrambled back to their penthouse to grab their hidden emergency bags, I had already turned their glass palace into a cage. The moment the heavy, reinforced steel door hissed shut behind them, the smart home security system transitioned into total lockdown mode. The elevators were disabled, the windows were shuttered with storm-grade titanium plates, and the air conditioning died, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. I watched them through the 4K sensors embedded in the walls. They were pacing the living room like trapped rats, Julian frantically punching codes into a keypad that no longer recognized his existence. Sarah was huddled in a corner, her expensive silk dress torn, staring at the darkened monitors that usually displayed their stock portfolio. "Julian, why won't it open?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "The backup override. Use the manual key." "The manual override is digital, Sarah," Julian roared, kicking the wall. "Everything is digital. It's all gone. The accounts, the house, the name. I'm looking at my phone and it says my social security number is invalid." I decided it was time to join the conversation. I tapped a key on my laptop, and every speaker in the penthouse, hidden in the ceilings, the bathrooms, and even the bedroom, roared to life with a low-frequency hum that made the floorboards vibrate. "You always did love the refined life, Julian," my voice echoed, cold and distorted through the high-end audio system. "I figured I should give you a few moments of absolute privacy to enjoy it." They both froze, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. "Elias," Sarah whispered, her face pale. "Elias, please. We were going to pay you. We just needed the IPO to clear. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake. We can fix this." "You can't fix a delete command, Sarah," I replied, my voice devoid of emotion. "You taught me that. You told me I was the crack in the wall. But look around. You're inside the wall now. You're trapped in the very shield I built for you. Every lock, every sensor, every bit of code you stole is now your jailer." Julian looked at the camera lens in the corner, his eyes bloodshot with terror. "What do you want?" "Money. We still have the offshore." "I already moved the offshore funds," I interrupted. "They're currently being distributed to the families of the engineers you blacklisted over the last decade. You're penniless, Julian. You're legally dead. And in about 3 minutes, the FBI will be at that front door with a master key I provided. They're very interested in the treason charges I've attached to your profile." The sirens began to wail in the street below, the blue and red lights bleeding through the thin gaps in the shutters. I watched them realize that there was no strategy left, no lie big enough to save them. The architect was finished with his work. "Goodbye, Julian." "Goodbye, Sarah," I said, my finger hovering over the final disconnect. "Enjoy the silence. It's the only thing you actually own now." I cut the feed, leaving them in the dark, waiting for the sound of the door being kicked in. The sirens faded into a memory, replaced by the rhythmic, percussive pulse of the Pacific Ocean against a black sand beach. I sat on a low wooden stool outside a small, solar-powered bungalow on an island whose name doesn't appear on most Western maps. The air was thick with the scent of wild hibiscus and salt, clean, honest smells that had nothing to do with the ozone of a server room or the stale rot of corporate ambition. On the small table beside me sat a rugged, air-gapped laptop. It was the only tether I had left to the world I had dismantled. I opened the browser one last time, routed through 7 layers of ghost proxies. The headlines were a frantic, shifting mess of scandal and ruin. Julian and Sarah's faces were no longer on the covers of tech magazines. They were in grainy mugshots, stripped of their expensive lighting and designer armor. The report spoke of a total systemic collapse at Apex Cyber, a company now being liquidated to pay for a decade of fraudulent activity. They were headed for a federal facility where smart technology was a luxury of the past. I felt a strange, hollow satisfaction. I hadn't just beaten them. I had rewritten their reality until it reflected the truth of their characters. They had wanted to be legends, so I made them a myth, a story mothers would tell their children about the dangers of building an empire on someone else's soul. I looked at my own hands. For the first time in years, they weren't hovering over a keyboard in a frantic race against a deadline. I closed the laptop lid and felt the finality of the click. My own erasure was just as complete as theirs. To the world, Elias Thorne was a disgraced hacker who had vanished into the ether. To the islanders, I was just a quiet man who fixed their fishing boat electronics and kept to himself. I had reclaimed my code, my peace, and my future. The sun began to dip below the horizon, bleeding a deep, fiery violet into the sky. I stood up and walked toward the water, leaving the laptop behind. The Ghost Protocol was finished. The Trojan horse had done its duty and disintegrated. There were no more back doors to guard, no more mirrors to hold up to the faces of monsters. I waded into the surf, the cool water erasing the last of the motel's grime from my skin. The architecture of my life was finally my own, built on a foundation of silence and absolute freedom. I wasn't just rebooting, I was starting a new program, and for the first time, there were no bugs in the system.